Hi, my name's Ian from serialforeigner.photo, and today we're going to have a go at making cyanotype prints. Alright, so cyanotype prints are one of the oldest forms of permanent photography. That's photography where you get to keep an image as a permanent record of whatever it was you were shooting. Obviously before that people had camera obscuras, were able to project an image onto a wall or onto a screen, but cyanotype is one of the earliest forms of actual photography as we would recognise it today. So before we start, we need a few things. We're going to need some paper, obviously. I'm using watercolour paper. This is Arches Aquarelles, 340 grams per square metre paper. It's very thick, very solid. And you want solid paper because you're going to wash it in boiling water when we're done. So regular A4 print paper is not going to handle that kind of abuse. Also, I've got this nice rough, unfinished edge on the corner here, which is on the edge here, which is very nice. Gives it a kind of handmade vibe to it. This paper has it's cold pressed, it has two sides. It has a slightly less rough and a slightly more rough side. We're going to use a slightly smoother side for our prints. You're going to want the sensitizing liquid. It's this stuff. I made a blog post about making this previously. I was going to make a video, but 20 minutes of me banging away with a pestle and mortar isn't a terribly compelling video. This is a solution of potassium ferrocyanide and ammonium iron oxalate, mostly. Although it's a cyanide solution, it's not actually terribly dangerous. Having said that, not terribly dangerous doesn't mean actually good for you, so you want to take some care when you're using it. This is a citric acid solution, 40% citric acid solution. We use this as an additional contrast agent. It gives the image more contrast. Citric acid is actually very easy to get hold of. It's a food additive. It's what makes your fizzy cola bottles fizzy. And you make a 40% solution just by adding 40 grams of citric acid and hydrocitric acid, which you can buy in like bakery supply stores, to 60 milliliters of water, and that's your 40% solution. Sorry, 100 milliliters of water, that's your 40% solution. Okay, so let's talk about a bit of history. So, like I said, this is one of the oldest forms of photography. It was developed in the 19th century by a guy called William Herschel, and then it was refined after that by William Fox Talbot, who was an early photography pioneer and a chemist. One of the first female photographers, a lady called Anna Atkins, who was a botanist in the 19th century, was a friend of Fox Talbot's, and he introduced her to this process, and she made a set of really stunning images of algae and lichens that she collected from around the coast of the UK, using the cyanotype process to basically create silhouettes of these plants. And she published a book which is recognised as being the first book in the world to have photographic plates when it was published. So it's a very old, very well understood process. Recently, in the last 10 years or so, a British chemist and photographer called Mike Ware came up with a better way of doing it. He came up with what we call the new cyanotype recipe. The old cyanotype recipe has some drawbacks. First of all, it's not a very high contrast process. You watch a lot of your image, when you do the final wash, you'll watch a lot of your images disappear. You have to overexpose quite a lot to be able to keep any kind of discernible image. The exposure time is also quite long. It can be as much as 20-30 minutes in some cases for a single image in the sunshine. And also, the old cyanotype recipe requires two different liquids to be combined just before you make the print, because when the two liquids are combined, they have a very short shelf life. The new cyanotype recipe uses one liquid, which has a shelf life of up to 5 years. It's a very, very long-lasting solution. It gives you very high contrast prints, gives you much higher print quality, and it develops much faster. Here, I live in Bangkok, which is 13 degrees north of the equator, so we get a lot of sunshine here. And here, my exposure times are in the order of 1.5 to 2.5 minutes on average, depending on the negative. Next thing you need, obviously, is negative. Now, cyanotype is a contact printing process, so the print you get is exactly the same size as the negative that you use. Now, if you're a large format shooter and you're shooting 8x10 large format negatives, then hooray, you have access to nice big negatives straight out of the gate. Most of us aren't shooting 8x10, and most of us are shooting either 35mm medium format or digital full frame APS-C, whatever. So most of us need a way to create larger negatives from our smaller image. Now, I got around that. I got a solution which I went and bought plastic printable film from an office supply store. It's inkjet printable. It's on one side it has a coating that lets it take ink. the other side is just shiny. When I bought this stuff, the lady in the store asked me if I wanted it to be transparent on both sides. I had no idea what to say to that. So I can just print this out. What I do is I open the image in Photoshop, I invert it, I convert it to monochrome if it's not already in monochrome, then I invert it, and usually I add a brightness contrast layer to darken the image and make it more contrasty. What you'll find when you're making these prints is that the more contrasty your image, the better result you're going to get, and the more latitude you have for developing. If you have a very thin negative with very subtle contrast, you have a very narrow window in which you're going to be able to get the correct exposure. But by a strong contrast negative gives you more latitude to be wrong. What happens if you've got the wrong exposure is quite clear. If you've got too much sunlight, if you leave it out for too long, you end up with a very dark negative like this. You see, there's almost nothing you can see here. You can vaguely see the dark parts of Sabrina's face here, but almost nothing else. If you don't leave it out for long enough, you get low contrast, low definition negative like this one. And if you're go a bit crazy and you're not able to wait until your paper is dry before you expose it, you get this where all the sensitizer just washes away. So let's start off with the paper then. So here is our paper, here is our sensitizer, here is our citric acid. I'm using this silicone brush to spread the sensitizer around on the paper. The sensitizer is very, very thin, it has almost no surface tension. If you're using a bristle brush, all your sensitizer is going to get sucked up into those bristles and you're going to lose a lot of it. The absolute best way is to use a glass coating rod, which is basically a glass rod with a handle in the middle. You pour your sensitizer along the length of the rod and just one smooth motion cover the whole paper. I don't have one of those, they're quite hard to get hold of here in Thailand, so I'm using a silicone artist brush. It cost me about $3 from a local art store, equivalent to $3 local art store. So let's start off. Now you want to do this under tungsten light. You don't want to do it in daylight or under fluorescent light because this is UV reactive, UV sensitive solution, and if you expose it to daylight, expose it to fluorescent light, it's going to start to develop, it's going to start blue. So first of all we put a few drops of the citric acid solution on the paper, and then we put some of our sensitizer. I've just got this little syringe I bought from the Thai equivalent of dollar store. Everything is 60 baht kind of place. I'm just using this to spread the sensitizer around. You need about 2 milliliters to cover this slightly smaller than A4 piece of paper. And then we spread it around, being fairly quick. We don't want to waste too much time with the silicone brush. And as you can see, it's very thin. It's washing around all over the place. I've got to be quite careful not to slosh it off the edge of the paper. Now I can cover the paper fairly easily, fairly quickly. Now if I want to, I can be clever about this. I can do some little artistic effects. I can mask off bits of the paper to either give myself nice neat edges where the sensitizer ends, or I can mask off bits of paper to create stencil effects on the paper where the sensitizer won't appear at all. All that sort of stuff is possible if you want to go nuts and go crazy. Remember, this is a negative process, so anything you mask off is going to be shown in negative when you make the print. So let's cover this. Just move it around until there's no more pooling evident anywhere. Alright. Nice and thin, spread it on. And then when that's spread on, we leave it to dry in a nice dark place about an hour. You can speed this up by putting a hairdryer over the top of it or putting an airing cupboard. Once you stick it under somewhere dark to dry. This away too. Now in best Blue Peter fashion, I have some I made earlier, so let's get those out. So here is our paper, here is our negative. Now you can use a contact frame for printing this stuff, that's the best way to do it, but again contact frames are quite hard to find here in Thailand. It's a way where you can register the paper onto the contact and you can lift the back up and check the exposure without losing registration. What I did, I went to the same dollar store where I bought this stuff. I bought the cheapest picture frame I could find, cannibalized it for the backboard and the glass. So what happens is we put our paper on here, we put our negative on the top. I'm going to cover this. Remember, our printable area is slightly smaller than the negative area, which is by design. So we're going to lose the sides of her arms here. I'm also going to make sure the bottom of the negative where this hard cut off is outside the printable area, so we don't get an ugly sharp line in the middle of this. Then we put the glass on the top. We put the glass on to make sure that everything stays in registration. If there's any gaps between the negative and the paper, you'll end up with out of focus effects. Obviously if the paper moves around, you'll end up with fuzzy edges and unsharp image. It's not what we want to see at all. So clip this together. I reckon this is a 2-minute exposure. So we're just going to put this, set our timer, and let's just go. Alright, so my print's been out on my sunny balcony for the last 2 minutes. So here it is. Now you can see, is take the clips off, take the glass away. Now what we'll see is that the print looks almost solarized. You see the dark areas are this kind of blue, the light areas is kind of bright, deep sea green area, and that's going to get washed away. So we put a little bit of dish soap in the bottom of our tray. It's just a little thing I bought to wash with. It's from an office supply store. The dish soap stops the developer from backstaining. Also it makes our print smell all lemony fresh, which is very important obviously. Helps it clear faster as well. So this is just boiling water straight from the kettle. We fill up our tray with that. So soapy water, very hot soapy water. I find using boiling water is best because it gives us this, it helps clear it much faster. If you use cold water, it doesn't clear as quickly. Now hopefully what you can see is that the excess sensitizer is washing away. We've got our images showing through already, which is nice. Very hot water. I should probably be wearing gloves for this, but you know, I do this a lot. I have pretty much heat-proof fingers by now. So a little bit about exposure times. Depending on where you live, obviously, the exposure time is going to vary a lot. As I said previously, if you're using thin negatives, your exposure latitude is much narrower, and you generally want a shorter exposure time than if you're using thick negatives. Depending on where you live, then the exposure time will change as well. If you're I live 13 degrees north of the equator here in Bangkok, so I get a lot of very strong sunlight during the day. If you're in the far north, or the far south I guess, all of my fans out there in Tierra del Fuego, so a shout out for you, what you'll find is that you'll need to expose for longer because you're getting less strong sunlight. It's being attenuated through the atmosphere, through more of the atmosphere. And it's possible you may have like 10-15 minute exposure times, depending on where you are. If you're in the very far north, if you're like in Alaska or Sweden or something like that, then you could even end up with like half an hour to an hour or so, especially towards the autumn or spring equinoxes. So here we go. You can see our image is coming through quite nicely now. We've got quite a good contrast coming in. This is just agitation is super important. Just keep the thing moving as much as you can. If you have access to running hot water, that would be even better. If you just like run it under very, very hot tap water, that would work just as well. Here in Thailand, you don't get hot tap water. The tap water comes out of the sink at room temperature, which isn't exactly cold, but it's not hot either. The only hot water we have is for showering, which is a weird fact of life here in Bangkok. So you can see our image is showing through quite nicely now. You can see the difference that we've got already. You see the dark blue area that was around here has now faded away to this nice, attractive pale blue. The dark areas, which were this kind of green, sea green colour, have now resolved to almost black, or a very, very dark blue. There's a little bit of a shame we have a slight fogging area here in the middle, but there's not a lot we can do about that. The paper was a little bit stale when I used it, so that's on me. That's what happens if the paper starts to go. When you take your paper out of storage to use it, the paper will last about 4 or 5 hours before it needs to be used, depending as long as it's kept dark. When you take it out, it should be the sensitizer should still be a nice lemony yellow colour, same as it was when you put it on, maybe a little bit darker. If it started to go green, or even worse, if it's blue, then it started to fog already. There's some light hit it and it's starting to fog. You're going to lose a little bit of the contrast as a result of that. You're going to get these artifacts like you see here, this like fogging effect in the middle, just on her hand and shoulder here. If it's gone completely blue, then it's useless, and just either use the other side of the paper or throw it away, because it's not worth even trying to use that anymore. So here we can see coming through. Here's our image. Already done. And this is why, of course, obviously using this boiling water, bathing it for about 3 or 4 minutes each time, is why we need to use the thick watercolour paper. because obviously thinner paper, less strong paper isn't going to survive this kind of handling. I would suggest you probably aren't going to get away with using anything lighter than about 280 grams per square metre. This is 340 grams per square metre, Archer's Aquarel watercolour paper. This is acid free, which is important because you don't want the chemicals in the paper to be reacting with the cyanotype chemicals. But if you're using a high quality watercolour paper, you should be fine. I have tried using other papers as well. This is a Japanese calligraphy paper. I tried using 6x6 medium format negatives directly. It wasn't a huge success, as you can see. They're still quite hard to see what's going on even with medium format negatives. But it was interesting to play with that. And this paper is very smooth. It's almost like plastic, in fact. It's a bamboo paper for Japanese calligraphy. And I had to leave it to dry for much longer than normal because the sensitizer did not soak into the paper at all. It was almost water repellent, the paper was. It was very hard to use. You can use a lot of different kinds of paper. You can use handmade papers. As long as it all survives this process, go nuts. So there we go, here's our final image. Now we've washed out all the sensitizer. A nice picture of my friend Chloe from Slovakia. Ready to go. So now we just hang it up and it's ready.